Okay, everybody, so the day that a lot of people are waiting for is here. AMD is launching their mid-range GPUs into a market that's absolutely ready for some competition right now, or at least some stock. So what I want to do here is I want to get right into this video because we have a lot to cover. Not only are we doing gaming in this one, we're also doing STEM applications, we're going to be doing some AI testing and some creator workloads too. So let's see how everything shakes out. Anyways, the RTX 5070 Ti launched a few weeks ago for $750. Well, the real price, if you actually found one, was closer to $850 or more. But let's just say, for argument's sake, it was $750. And yesterday, the $550 RTX 5070 sort of came out. That's because, based on all of our conversations right now with retailers, it is going to be harder to get than the 5090. Well, that created a $200 price gap that's about to be filled by the RX 9070 XT, which is supposed to start at $600, while the RX 9070 is meant to go toe-to-toe against the RTX 5070 at $550. I should also mention AMD isn't planning on using any reference designs this time. Instead, they're putting this launch entirely on the shoulders of their board partners. And if all the conversations I've had with retailers turn out to be true, there's actually going to be a good number of cards available. This is not a paper launch. And to that point, for this video at least, we have two of PowerColor's Reaper Edition cards, one 9070 XT and the other one 9070. Now, according to PowerColor and AMD, these are both supposed to be at AMD's starting at MSRPs, and they're supposed to be widely available at all of the retailers. But we're just gonna have to see if that comes true. Another thing I should mention is there's going to be two tiers of cards in this launch. One with default power settings like the Reapers we have here, and one between 30 and 45 watts higher for OC models. We've actually got a few of those here too from XFX, Asus, and a few other board partners that I'm gonna be covering in an upcoming roundup. And you'll see some shots of them in this video since we were testing those PowerColors until the very last minute over this last weekend. Anyways, speaking of power, one of AMD's primary focuses for RDNA 4 has always been to narrow the performance per watt gap with NVIDIA. Now, according to the on-paper specifications for these cards, well, they're getting pretty close to the RTX 5070 and 5070 Ti. But in reality, how does that shake out? So the first thing I need to mention right away is the fact that neither AMD nor NVIDIA list the highest possible power limits for their GPUs. Instead, they give power consumption under typical conditions, and cards are able to flex slightly above or even below that point. You see that here with both the 9070 series at 1440p. The XT's 340 watt rating is pretty true to reality in our testing, while the 220 watt 9070 typically hovers around the 233 watt mark. So its lower heat output probably allows AMD's boost algorithm to request a bit more juice. The same thing goes for 4K. Basically, the power consumption numbers remain identical across the board. Sure, there are some dips here and there, specifically in CS2 and Hogwarts, but overall, we're seeing the same power consumption numbers at 4K as we did at 1440p. This, however, is not the way NVIDIA cards behave. If we overlay their average power consumption results over the 9070 series at both resolutions, it's evident that their power requirements are a lot more variable. Sure, some of these situations can be chalked up to driver or game limitations, but if the 5070 series algorithm detects it doesn't need full power to reach optimal performance, it doesn't call it up. Meanwhile, for the most part, the 9070 series just goes full on most of the time. But compare this to the 7900 series and it's evident that RDNA 4 may be a pretty big step forward in terms of performance per watt. So exactly what AMD wanted. And more importantly, the RX 9070 and 9070 XT likely won't require anyone upgrading from a 5700 or 6700 series to run out and buy a brand new power supply just for compatibility. All right, so with that setting the stage, let's get right into gameplay testing. And I just want to remind everybody, once again, if you've seen our previous GPU reviews from the last, I don't know, couple of weeks, couple of months, the system specifications, they have not changed one iota. The only real thing that has changed is, of course, the GPU driver revisions. So let's get right into those numbers. And our first game, Alan Wake, shows some absolutely gangbusters results for the new AMD cards. At both 1440p and 4K, the XT's average numbers beat the much more expensive 5070 Ti, while the 9070 stays well ahead of the 5070. The only hiccup here is those 1% lows. While they're good, NVIDIA still wins in that respect. Another thing you'll notice is the improvements versus the 7900 GRE are actually a bit ahead of AMD's own predictions. Black Myth is a very different story though, with the 9070 XT losing to the 5070 Ti, while the 9070 is a literal carbon copy of the 5070's performance. Both offer very good frame rate increases over the RX 7000 series, especially at 4K, but I'd never use any of these cards to play this game at 4K anyways, at least not without upscaling enabled, since none of these provide a great overall gaming experience. Meanwhile, Baldur's Gate has always been one of AMD's best optimized games, and that shows here, but while the RX 9070 series performs well against the NVIDIA cards, especially at 4K again, their 1% lows do lag behind the RX 7900 series. To me, that simply points towards AMD still needing to make some tweaks here and there to their driver stack for optimal performance. Something else we noticed is AMD's borderline horrendous performance in some key esports games like CS2. I mean, it's not like the RX 7000 series were good here, but both 9070 cards even failed to live up to AMD's claimed increases over the 7900 GRE. So again, something obviously needs to be addressed on the software side, but it's questionable how much can be clawed back since all RDNA generations seem to struggle here. And yet in most situations, the RX 9070 XT tends to emulate the RTX 5070 Ti's performance for much less money, and it also manages to beat the RX 7900 XT more often than not. On the other hand, the RX 9070 has a lot tougher fight on its hands since it can't really distinguish itself from the identically priced RTX 5070. But that positioning is very situationally dependent. In some games, the 97 and 5070 are neck and neck, while in others, like Doom, the AMD card can easily take over the lead. The same thing goes for the 9070 XT. It can keep up with the 5070 Ti while staying at least 10% faster than the 7900 XT. And remember, that card launched at $900. The only real problem is that every time there's a few titles where AMD's new GPUs are super competitive, we also stumble across a game which just seems to lack optimizations. And that causes all Radeon GPUs, and specifically the 9070 series, to dreadfully underperform at 1440p, but also come up short versus the NVIDIA cards at 4K. Honestly, it will be interesting to see whether AMD's driver team can salvage this. Hogwarts also shows a ton of potential for the RX 9070 and RX 9070 XT. The only problem is that both fall into the same hole as the RX 7000 series. Simply put, while the average frame rates are competitive, every AMD GPU devolves into a stuttering mess in this game. They just don't deliver fluid gameplay like the NVIDIA cards here, and that's a concern since Hogwarts Legacy is based off of UE4, one of the most popular game engines around right now. Like I said before, if those few hiccups are ironed out and every game saw these new cards performing like they do in Horizon Forbidden West, then AMD would absolutely have some price to performance champs on their hands. Because when these cards are able to flex their muscles, they can easily put the screws to the RTX 5070 series, though more so with the 9070 XT, since no matter which way you look at things, paying $750 or more for an RTX 5070 Ti looks like a really bad decision right now. Because while there are surely games that have NVIDIA specific optimizations, AMD has a few in their back pocket too, like Black Ops 6. And this points towards why when AMD showed the 9070 XT at CES, it looked so freaking good. There's some serious love between the Infinity Ward engine and Radeon GPUs. Unfortunately, Rainbow Six falls into the same category as CS2, though not in such a drastic way. While the RX 9070 XT and 9070 do offer performance increases over the 7900 GRE and even the XT, they fall behind the competing NVIDIA cards. And I think Spider-Man Remastered is a great microcosm of the overall situation here. The RX 9070 mirrors the 5070 pretty well at 1440p and does pull ahead at 4K, while the XT model tends to lose to the 5070 Ti at the lower resolution and becomes very competitive at 4K. It also seems like both cards are trending quite a bit below AMD's 1440p performance claims versus the GRE, but align pretty well at 4K. If anything, this shows how a larger memory footprint really allows the 9070 series to distinguish itself at higher resolutions. Then again, there are games like Starfield where the AMD cards absolutely shine. It almost feels like the flip of a coin. Sometimes the 9070 series gets some blockbuster wins, while other times it really struggles to justify its pricing. But I can say the exact same thing about NVIDIA, because when looking at the overall landscape of these results, its obvious performance is increasingly becoming divided into one camp or another, either green or red, but not both. I just wish more titles fell into the same category as Warhammer 3 Total War, where the game engine doesn't seem to have any preference and every GPU seems to have their optimizations all properly lined up. It's like perfect. But even here, you can see the relative benefits of having that 16GB frame buffer, especially again at 4K. Moving on to ray tracing in Alan Wake, and it's really a yin and yang situation based on resolution. At 1440p, the RX 9070 series boasts huge uplifts over the RX 7000 generation, and also compete pretty well with the RTX 5000 series. But then at 4K, it all falls apart to the point where both cards deliver completely unplayable frame rates. Avatar shows pretty much the same thing at 1440p, but also cements one thing into the equation. You don't want to use any of these GPUs to play ray-traced games without some form of upscaling or frame generation working behind the scenes. Another thing we're starting to see is games that heavily optimize their ray tracing pipeline exclusively for NVIDIA GPUs. I mean, heck, it's called NVIDIA Ray Tracing directly within Black Myth Wukong's overall options, and you can see the result of that. And you know what? This really pisses me off. If anything, developers should be encouraged to make RT more accessible, kind of like democratize it. But no, instead we get crap like this that pushes gamers even further away. Luckily, there are some titles that just don't play favorites to that extent, and Cyberpunk is one of those. It highlights something really important too. With the RTX 5000 series, NVIDIA has been sort of treading water with RT performance. It's no better than the 4000 series, and that's allowed AMD to almost catch up. And that's gotta be worrying for NVIDIA, since in games they used to champion as being standouts in their ray tracing initiative, like Doom, well, the RX 9070 XT can almost match the $100 more expensive RTX 5070 Ti. Meanwhile, the RX 9070 easily outmatches the 5070. The same thing goes for Hogwarts. The 1% lows, yes, they're still trash, but overall it's a day and night difference versus the RX 7000 series. Honestly, NVIDIA's been put on notice here, because if AMD's next generation UDNA architecture can make a similar or a larger jump forward, things could get really interesting. And finally, there's Spider-Man Remastered, another game that used to favor NVIDIA GPUs in a pretty big way. But now with the 9070 series, the playing field is pretty much level, even at 4K. But then again, I'd argue that enabling ray tracing in this game actually makes it look a bit worse. So I just stick to raster and enjoy the higher frame rates. So those are our gaming results, but let's be honest here. Graphics cards in modern systems aren't always asked to only game. There are a ton of other tasks that people typically ask them to accomplish. That could be anything from like video transcoding to exporting videos or edited videos through NLEs like Premiere and Resolve. So let's see how the RX 9070 series does in those situations. Can it improve on the already pretty impressive showings that the RX 9700 series has shown in the past? In Blender cycles, NVIDIA clearly has an edge with their optics renderer over AMD's HIP implementation. And even within the Radeon ecosystem, it seems like there's a lot of optimizations left to do, since the RX 9070 and 9070 XT both underperform when compared to the 7900 GRE. Things look a lot better when moving to EV, with both cards beating the RTX 5070 Ti. Though once again, there's the question about whether or not this is the best possible output for the RX 9070 series, since neither GPU can convincingly beat the GRE again. Meanwhile, the wheels really fall off in Handbrake. We tried the latest public release, beta builds, and even alpha builds, but in the end, it was pretty obvious that the new series isn't fully supported by this program yet. We'll make sure to keep tabs on it and post updates if anything changes, but right now, this isn't a good look. Meanwhile, the resolve numbers are about what we'd expect for generational improvements over the RX 7900 series, with the 9070 XT actually being faster than the 7900 XT. You might also be wondering about why the RTX 5070 gets such terrible results versus the 5070 Ti. Well, that's because it gets a single encoder layout, while the Ti and the 5080 have dual NVENC layouts. Premiere does something a little bit different, since even in its current beta forms, it doesn't properly support NVIDIA's multiple encode-decode design. Instead, Adobe has built in very clear optimizations for CUDA. Premiere also benefits from larger memory footprints and more bandwidth. That's why the 7800 XT can beat the GRE. So while the 9070 series gets respectable results here, beating the RTX 5000 series is almost impossible. And moving on to viewport performance in SolidWorks, where higher frame rates are critical, and for whatever reason, the new AMD cards just fall on their faces. They can't even beat the RX 7900 GRE or RTX 5070. Somehow I think this might be a situation where OpenGL support for RDNA 4 will slowly be rolled out, and it isn't quite ready for launch. And finally, 3ds Max shows us a bit better situation by using a direct 3D11 path, but the numbers put out by the 9070 series aren't that great, with the 9070 tying the GRE and the XT moving barely 10% beyond that. Another thing I wanted to tackle is, of course, AI workloads. AI is in the zeitgeist these days, and AMD has made some pretty significant claims about the performance increases of this series over previous generations. And I also have to mention something here very quickly. The AI space is revolutionizing, not even evolving, at a very, very rapid pace. So the results that you see today in this review might be completely flipped on their heads tomorrow. We're just gonna have to see where everything lies in a couple of months. So let's start with a more synthetic workload, the Procyon integer benchmark. And unfortunately, there's no support for the RTX 5000 series yet. But we see two very different stories for AMD. While the 9070 series boasts some insane performance increases in integer workloads, their FP16 performance is actually a downgrade versus the RX 7900 series. Moving on to image generation, a test where we're using the amount of time it takes to generate an image, and one that actually supports NVIDIA cards, well, NVIDIA's dominance is pretty clear. But there's also a great story for the newest Radeon cards, since they deliver a huge improvement over the previous generation, just like AMD promised. The next stop is performance in a few open source AI models, and the results are a bit less extreme for the RX 9070 series over AMD's previous cards. While there are some impressive performance increases, nothing can touch NVIDIA cards when they're used in their native CUDA environment. Even with the 14B model, which is typically memory limited, the 12 gig RTX 5070 is still able to remain comfortably ahead of the two AMD GPUs. But the tables rapidly get turned when the RX 9070 and 9070 XT are able to run through their own ROCm environment. Not only that, but this test highlights why memory capacity and bandwidth are so important for most AI workloads. Regardless of whether it's the 8B or 14B model, every AMD card puts down some really good numbers, with the 9070 series actually leading the RTX 5080 of all cards. The only exception is the 7900 GRE, since it's slightly memory bandwidth constrained when compared to the other models we're showing here. Moving on to a distilled model of Deepseek on a level playing field using Vulkan, the results are pretty much the same as they were in the last test, where cards pairing faster, higher capacity memory layouts get better performance. The standing of the two RX 9070 GPUs does get knocked down by a bit, but their results are still impressive, with the vanilla 9070 almost matching the RTX 5070 Ti. Meanwhile, the RX 9070 XT surpasses the 5080 in 8B model testing and is a bit behind in the 14B model. All right, let's sum this all up, and I'm gonna put all my sort of cards on the table here. I'll admit to a little bit of an intrinsic bias towards the RX 9070 series. It's because it's very evident that after all of the NVIDIA launches, the GPU market simply needed a kind of reset, a little bit of a shakeup. Now, when everything's settled, did the RX 9070 series actually accomplish that? Well, at 1440p, the RX 9070 XT is 24% faster than the 7900 GRE, and the standard 9070 gets a 12.5% uplift, which leads it to essentially tying the RTX 5070. Yes, even at 4K. But I can't emphasize this enough. The real value here lies with the XT, since its $50 premium goes a long way towards competing with the 5070 Ti. It's only about 10% behind, while on paper at least being a whole $150 US cheaper. And I know a lot of you were hoping for the XT to deliver RTX 5070 Ti style frame rates, and for the RX 9070 to convincingly beat the 5070. And they actually do in many games, particularly in situations where their 16GB memory layouts can start flexing, which is in more areas than you might have expected. But I feel like a broken record here with every single AMD launch. They need to work on driver optimizations because Rainbow Six, Space Marine 2, and CS2, along with the 1% lows in Hogwarts, Baldur's Gate, and a few other games, drag these averaged results downwards. So how well these cards perform in the reviews that you're seeing today will heavily depend on the selection of games that are being tested. There are a few other red flags here too, outside of gaming. So look, the 9070 series has some almost remarkable uplifts in AI workloads when compared to the 7000 series. But when you look at GPU compute, that's where things go all over the place. So for example, Blender, some of those workloads, we actually saw amazing performance for the 9070 series. On the other hand, in Handbrake and in SolidWorks, things just fell apart. Now, to me, that points out that there is still a wide range of missing optimizations for this architecture. But the most interesting thing for me, and likely the most worrying thing for NVIDIA, is how strong AMD has suddenly become in ray tracing, at least if we don't count heavily NVIDIA-sponsored titles like Black Myth Wukong into the equation. The RX 9070 series is a leap forward versus the previous generation, and if they can deliver what's been promised for FSR4 as being a good competitor for DLSS4, well, things could get very interesting in the future. So to sum things up, I think that overall, I would call this mission accomplished for AMD, provided they can do two things. One of those is keep the stock replenished in the retail channel. People have to be able to buy these things. And the other real wild card here is they have to keep pricing as close as possible to MSRP and those little bit of premium that board partners are going to be charging for their OC models. Look, despite brewing trade wars and everything else, AMD has a real chance here to make a mark on the GPU market. Now, I would recommend the 9070 XT every single time somebody would ask me over the RX 9070, simply because it's just a more compelling solution for only $50 more. But anyways, with all of that aside, personally, I am the most excited about what these cards will mean for more affordable price points, things that people can actually afford in the GPU market, not those $750 GPUs, but what can be done below those price points. And I think, and I'm hoping that this is just the beginning. So anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.